What's going on, guys? Welcome to my command line crash course. So if you're a developer of any kind, chances are you're going to be using the command line at some point. You may just be installing some npm dependencies as a front-end developer, or you may be logging into servers via SSH and performing more advanced tasks. But either way, it's good to learn the basics when it comes to, navigating your file system, working with files and folders, etc. So in this crash course, we're going to be looking at all the basics and a little bit more than that. I'll be using a Mac, but you should be able to follow along whether you're on Mac, Windows, or Linux. I'm going to explain kind of the differences between the operating systems and what options you have and so on. All right, so that's it. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so before we get started, I just want to mention today's sponsor, Agora. So Agora is a real-time engagement platform that provides us with all the tools for building out features like audio and video calling, along with real-time data signaling right into your applications. With Agora, you get SDKs and you get low-code tools to build all sorts of video calling features like group chats, with screen sharing and recording. You can stream to third-party platforms like YouTube and so much more. If you've ever set up WebSockets for real-time messaging, you know that it can be quite the headache. So Agora makes it easy to implement all of these real-time features. So for more information, you can click the link in the description or visit agora.io today. All right, so I just want to spend about 10 minutes or so talking about a few things. And if you want to skip right to learning the commands, I'll put a timestamp in and you can do that. But there is some confusion when it comes to some of the terms we use, like command line, terminal, shell. It can be confusing for beginners. So I want to talk about that as well as some of the differences in operating systems. But I want to start off with just some reasons why you would even want to learn the command line or the terminal. And again, I'll be using some of these terms interchangeably. So it might seem a little weird when you have a powerful operating system that is a GUI or a graphical user interface where you can just point and click and do things. So why would you want to remember all of these commands? There's actually a lot of different reasons, but I'll just go over some of the big ones. So number one, you have greater control. The GUI or the graphical user interface of an operating system, it does make everything nice and easy and pretty. However, using the command line or the terminal is sort of like having back-end access to the system. So you can do things that you can't typically do with the graphical interface. The GUI only gives you so many options. With that said, you do have to be careful with certain commands. Some of the advanced commands can perform really complex operations on your system, and you also typically manage things like permissions and user access with the command line. So the next one is speed and efficiency. I think it might sound strange to some people, but learning to navigate your system through the command line allows you to do a lot of things more quickly and easily. There's certain tasks, especially when dealing with multiple files or even hundreds or thousands of files at once, that would take you hours or even days to manually handle within the graphical interface. Instead, you can just run a couple commands. You can also alias commonly used commands to do things even faster. You don't have to go back and forth from the keyboard to mouse. Your hands are always on the keyboard. So working with the command line can be more efficient in many ways. So the next one is to access remote servers. And if you're a web developer and you're deploying websites or web applications, a lot of times you'll need to log in via SSH, which is the secure shell. So basically you can log into servers through the command line. I do have a crash course on SSH if you're interested. We're not going to get into SSH in this particular video. Also, there are some operating systems that don't even have a graphical interface. These are called headless operating systems. I actually have a Ubuntu server running as my home server, which is a headless version of Linux Ubuntu. It doesn't even have a monitor or a keyboard. I just log in via SSH from my computer. So the next reason is command line tools. I think no matter what area of tech you're in, you're probably going to use some tools that are not GUI based. A lot of tools can't just be downloaded and installed through a graphical interface. Even front-end developers now, they used to be able to get away with not really having to learn anything in the command line. But nowadays, you have all your packages and frameworks and stuff are all installed via NPM or Node Package Manager. Of course, Git version control. And I know there are GUI programs for Git, but in my opinion, typing in a couple commands is easier than learning some of those GUI tools. We also have preprocessors like SAS. We have task runners, bundlers like Webpack and Parcel. These are all front-end web development tools that are used from within the command line. And then the last reason I have is just getting hired. Chances are, if you're trying to become a developer of any kind, you'll be required to at least know how to navigate around your system using the command line, and also how to use certain tools like NPM and Git. And it's just a great skill to have in general. All right, so often the terms command line, terminal, and shell are used interchangeably. You've seen I've already done it here. And usually the term command line is very Windows-centric and terminal is very Mac and Linux-centric. But I want to go through and talk about each of these terms and what they mean. So we'll start with the terminal, and I'm going to give you a really short history lesson to explain this. So back in the day, a terminal was an actual device with a screen that could display text and accept input. There was no tower or anything like that. It was just a keyboard and a monitor. In fact, I actually had one of these when I was a kid, and I thought it was so cool to be able to type and see the text pop up on the screen. So yeah, I'm pretty old. Anyway, it was usually connected to some big mainframe or early Unix-based system and allowed users to interact with it. Only text could be displayed on the screen. It was called a terminal because it was located where the wires from the computer ended or terminated. And then later on, hardware terminals were replaced with what we call terminal emulators. This is basically what we use now. It's software based. The actual program that you open up and you type in commands, you can use the terminal that comes with your operating system, or you can also install third-party terminal programs. For instance, on my Mac, I use iTerm2, and on Windows, I'll use either Git Bash or Hyper. All right. Now, the command line or the command prompt is the term that's used to describe the interface of the terminal. Okay, it's the interface that allows you to enter commands and get output from commands. Again, Windows does use this terminology a lot, and a lot of times they call their version of the terminal the command line, or CMD. And for those of you that use Windows, probably know that. All right, now the shell, in order to be able to use the terminal, there has to be a program on the computer that reads the input and displays output. This is called the shell. Different shells can have different capabilities and different ways of entering commands. So you can sort of think of the shell as the operating system of the terminal. Okay, Bash is the most common shell program and is usually the default on most Linux and Unix systems. And it was the default on Macs for a long time, up until recently they switched from Bash to ZSH, which is what I'll be using in this tutorial. But everything I do here can be done with Bash or ZSH. All right, now I want to talk a little bit more about Windows, because of course Microsoft has to be difficult with their own proprietary stuff. They've done this, for decades. Microsoft created the first OS for the IBM PC. It was called DOS, or Disk Operating System, and it was a command line based system. And it didn't use the Bash shell. It used something called command.com by default. And when Windows was created, it was actually just a regular piece of software that ran on top of DOS. And then later on, it became its own, an operating system in its own right. And I believe Windows XP was when the shell switched from command.com to cmd.exe, which is also very limiting, so they ended up creating PowerShell. Now, Windows command line and PowerShell are different than Unix-based shells on Linux and Mac OS. You can use a lot of the same commands, however, there are a lot of differences. And they have gotten better. Up until recently, you couldn't even use SSH on Windows by default. You had to download and install a tool called PuTTY, which was really aggravating. When I use Windows, I use a program called Hyper or Git Bash, which are Unix-based terminal emulators. And a lot of people also like the WSL, or the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which basically allows you to run Linux from within your Windows OS. I personally never got into that, but I do, because I do most of my development on Macs. Now, if you're following along on Windows and you don't use a specific emulator, I would highly recommend using Git Bash, which you can get at git-scm.com. Learning PowerShell is a great idea if you plan on being like a Windows system administrator or something like that. All right, so now that we've established what the terminal is, the command line, the shell, let's jump in and let's start learning some commands. All right, guys, so a couple things. I do have a gist file, a gist link in the description if you want to basically see any of the commands or any of the information that we talk about in this crash course. So you can see there's quite a bit here. We're going to go over all of this, but obviously you're not going to remember every single command, so you have this as a reference. All right, now another thing I want to mention is, since this is a beginner's course and I don't want to limit this to any particular operating system, I'm not really going to get into commands that have to do with permissions and groups and users. I'm going to assume that you're logged in as the root user or the administrator user. I may do another video on permissions in Linux, but I want this to be an OS agnostic course, so we're going to mainly focus on things like navigating the system, working with files and folders, looking at system resources, things like that. All right, so I just want to put that out there. All right, so I'm going to minimize this and go into my terminal, which I made nice and big. Hopefully you guys can see it. And like I said, I'm on a Mac. I'm using iTerm2, and I'm using Z Shell or ZSH. So if you want to use the regular Mac terminal, that's fine. If you're on Linux, you can use just about anything. I would just recommend that you use a Bash shell or a Z shell. If you're on Windows, you can use something like Git Bash or Hyper or Windows Subsystem for Linux. I wouldn't suggest using PowerShell because the PowerShell is different. Some of these commands aren't going to work. I'm not very familiar with PowerShell, so I can't tell you too much about it. But yeah, anything else should be just fine. Again, I tried to make this operating system agnostic. All right, so before we get into specific commands, I just want to look at some quick keyboard shortcuts. So the up and down key is very helpful because if you click up, it's going to show you your last command. Hit up again, it'll show you the one before that, and it goes, up to hundreds of commands. And then if I hit down, of course, it'll come back. So if you have the same command that you have to keep running over and over, there's no sense in typing it out. You can just go up to it and hit enter. So that's up and down. Now the tab key will autocomplete. So for instance, if I do like TOU and I hit tab, it's going to autocomplete the touch command. Touch it's used to create files. I'll get into that in a little bit. But if I were to do like MK and hit tab, since there's multiple commands that match that, it's going to show me a list of them. Okay, so keep that in mind. And then if I want to clear my terminal, I can do Control L. So for instance, if I list out all the directories here and then I do Control L, it just clears everything right up. And I'll be doing that all throughout the rest of the video. If I want to cancel a command, like let's say I do touch and I don't want to run it, of course I can delete it, or I can do Control C, which it'll basically go on to the next line and not execute it. So the next one is to search for a command. We can do Control R, and it'll just pop open this search box, and then if I start to type whatever I put in here, it's going to match the last command that matches that. So in this case, if I type in git, it's going to show git push as my last command that I ran. All right, and to get out of this, you can just do Control C. All right, and then Control D will close out the whole terminal. I'm not going to run it just because I don't want to resize the window and stuff, but Control D will close the terminal completely. All right, now I think the first command that I want to talk about is man, or the manual command, and that's used to get information on other commands. So let's say you want to learn more about the ls command. I can say man and then ls, and that's going to show me the documentation or the manual for that specific command. So you can see it lists directory contents. It gives me a description, and I can use my up and down arrows. I can also page up and page down. It'll also show any options, because a lot of times with commands you have different flags or different options you can use, so it'll show all that stuff. And then to exit this, you just hit Q for quit. Now, I believe on Windows, even if you use Git Bash, the man command doesn't work. However, there's another utility called help. So you can just put in the command you want to learn more about and then do --help, and that basically will do the same thing. All right, so let's see. The next thing I want to show you is just a couple simple helpful commands. So if you want to know the user you're logged in as, you can do whoami. As you can see, Brad Traversy. If you want the date and time, you can use the date command. If you want to clear the terminal, like I showed you, you can do Control-L, or you can just do clear. If you type in clear and run it, that'll clear it as well. Now, the next batch of commands I'm going to show you you're going to be using quite a bit because they're used to just navigate around your file system. So whether you're on your local machine or if you SSH into a server, if you want to navigate your way around, then you're going to need to know these. So the first one is pwd, and what that does is it prints the working directory. So basically the directory that you're currently in, which in my case is my home directory, users/Brad Traversy. Obviously yours will be different. Also, when you see the tilde character here, the squiggly line, that represents your home directory as well. Okay, so that's print working directory. The next one I'm going to show you is ls, which will list out the contents of a folder or a directory. When I say folder and directory, I mean the same thing. But if we run that with no additional parameters, it's going to list out the contents, including the folders and files of the current directory that I'm in, which is my home directory. Okay, if I were to, let's say I want to know what's in this downloads folder, then I could do ls and then downloads. If I do down and hit tab, it'll autocomplete as well. So if I do that, then it shows me what's in downloads. Okay, now there's some options or some flags that you can use with ls, including -a. What that does is it'll also show hidden files. So if I scroll up here, you'll see all these files with the dot. These are all hidden, and these don't show when you run ls unless you also add the a flag. All right, now if I want to show the long listing, I can do ls-l, and that just shows some extra information. In addition to the file and folder name, it'll also show the permissions, the owner, the group, the file size, and the date. So it just shows some extra information. Now I can combine options if I want. So let's say I want to do hidden files and I also want to do a long listing. So I could add the AL option like this. So you can see that if I scroll up, you can see the hidden files and we get the long listing. An easier way to do it or a shorter way is just to do -AL. So you don't have to have two hyphens. That'll do the same thing. All right, and then another one is -R, that'll reverse it. You might want to use, let's say, ls-reverse and hidden files, because then it shows the hidden files at the bottom, because they're usually at the top, but that reverses it. Okay, and there's other options as well. Again, you can look at the manual or the documentation for ls. So the next one is cd, which you'll be using all the time because that changes your directory. So if I just do cd without any options, it just takes me to my home directory, which I'm already in. Same thing if I do cd and then tilde. Okay, but let's say I want to go, let's see, we have our downloads folder. Let's do that. So I'll say cd downloads and enter, and now I'm in my downloads folder. So if I just do an ls, it's going to show me the contents of the downloads folder. Okay, and then if I want to go up one level back to where I was, I can do cd space ... Now if I want to go to the root of my machine, which you might do if you're SSH into a server, you could do cd and then /. And if I do an ls here, you can see that I'm in the root. Now if you ever get lost and you want to get back home, remember you just do cd with nothing else. Now, another one that you don't see too much is cd-, and what that does is it takes me back to the last folder I was in. Not the parent, but the last one I was in, which in this case is the root. Okay, so that's cd-, but let's just go back to the home folder. Now, if you want to open a folder or a file in your GUI from your terminal, you can do that. However, there's different commands for each operating system, so I'll show you each one. So on a Mac, it's going to be open. So let's say I want to open the downloads folder. So I could do that, and you can see it opens right up in my Finder. Now, if you're on Windows, it's going to be start. So you just do start and then whatever the file or folder name. On Linux, as far as I know, with most distributions, it's xdg-open and then whatever the file or folder. Okay. Now, I can also open URLs. So if I do open https traversymedia.com, then that'll go ahead and just open on my default browser. Now, the next batch of commands I'm going to show you have to do with actually creating and modifying files and directories. So the first command I'm going to show you is make directory, or mkdir, which just does exactly what it sounds like. It just creates a directory. So we'll create one. Let's call it my project. And now if I do an ls, we're going to see here we have a new folder or a new directory called my project. All right, so let's cd into that. So cd my project, and obviously there's nothing in here because we just created it. So to create a file, there's a few ways to do this, but one of the most common ways is to use the touch command. So we can say touch, and let's say we'll say index.html. All right, so if I do an ls, you can see that created a file called index.html, which right now, of course, is empty. Now we can even create multiple files. I could say touch, let's say file1.txt, file2.txt, file3.txt. And now if I do an ls, you'll see that all three of those files were created. Now, when it comes to deleting or removing a file, we use the rm command. So let's say rm, and we'll do file, let's say file3.txt. And if I do an ls, you'll see that that file is now gone. Now, we can also use the -i flag, which will just prompt you to see if, make sure you want to delete it. So let's say rm-i, and we'll say file2.txt, and you'll see it's just going to ask us if we want to remove it. We can say y and then enter, and then it goes ahead and removes that file. Now, when we're dealing with directories, it's a little different. So I'm going to create, let's say, make directory, and I'll just call this dir1. And you can see now we have a directory. If we want to remove that and we use the rm command, say dir1, it gives us a message that says dir1 is a directory. So if we want to use the rm command to delete a directory, we have to use the r flag. So let's say rm-r dir1, and now it's removed. Now, there might be cases where you have a directory that you want to delete and it has files and folders in it, and you get a message that says the folder is not empty. All right, in that case, you kind of have to force it with the -f option. So you would do rm-rf and then the directory name. Okay, just be aware when you're doing this, be very aware of what you're actually deleting, because when you're using the terminal, it takes just a tiny little mistake to create a big issue, and you're deleting files that you definitely don't want to. So just be aware of that. Now, I want to look into copying and moving files. So right now we have file1, we have an index.html. Let's say we want to, let's first of all create a directory, and let's call this, we'll call it source. Okay, so ls. Now inside of our my project folder, we also have a source folder. And let's say I want to copy file1. So with that, we can use cp, and then we're going to choose the file we want, so file1.txt, and I want to copy it into source. So I would say source/ and then file1.txt. Okay, so if I do an ls, file1 is still here because we didn't move it, we copied it. So if I ls source, and inside source, you'll see that that file was copied. Now I'm going to remove file1 from the my project folder. So let's say rm file1.txt, and now that's gone. Now to move a file, we can use the mv command. So let's do that. Let's clear this up. And let's say we want to move the index.html into the source folder. So we'll say mv, and let's say index.html. We want to move it to source/index.html. And now if I do an ls, notice that there's no more index.html in the my project folder, but if I look in the source folder, there is. All right, now if you want to rename a file or folder, you can also use the mv command. So let's say I want to rename source to src. So I could do mv source, and I want to rename it to src. And now if I do an ls, now I just have an src. We'll do ls src. Now I want to move file1.txt back out to the my project folder. I don't want it in the source folder. I also want to rename it to info.txt. So for those of you that don't already know how to do this stuff, pause the video and see if you can figure that out. Move the file1 out of the source folder and rename it to info.txt. All right, so to do that, very simple. We can just use move. And we can say file, where are we? No, that's in the source folder. So we want to say move source file1.txt to, we want to move it to the current folder, and we want to rename it to info.txt. So now if I do an ls, we should see info.txt. If we do an ls in the source folder, then we don't see that file1 anymore. All right, so we'll clear that up, and now I want to look at actually dealing with the content in the files, because up till now we've dealt with navigating around, moving, copying files, deleting, creating files, but we haven't dealt with anything inside of them. They've all just been empty. So one thing we could do, as I showed you before, is we can open, like I could say open info.txt, and that will open it in the GUI, so with your whatever your default text editor. In fact, since I have VS Code installed, I have the code command set up. So if I wanted to, for instance, open up my source index.html, I could do that. Let me just, 1 second, let me just bring this over. All right, so I could bring that over here. And let's say you just want to add a boilerplate. You guys don't have to do this, but I'll just add this, and we'll put an H1 in here and just say hello world, just to add something to this. And I'll go ahead and save it. All right, I'm going to close that up. So now our index.html has some content in it. If you wanted to add something to the info, you could, but I'm going to show you how you can add content directly through the terminal and not have to open up a text editor or something like that as well. But let's look at some ways to read the content from within the text editor. So we have something in our index.html. Now I want to show you the cat command, or the concatenate command. And this is very common. It allows you to create single or multiple files. It allows you to view the contents of a file. You can concatenate files and redirect output in the terminal or to other files. It's really powerful. But I usually use it just to kind of peek in and see what is in a file. So let's say cat, and then we'll do source/index.html, and you can see it shows me the content that's actually in that file. Now we could also use it to write to a file. So I'm going to clear this up, and we can say cat and then a right angle bracket, and basically what we're doing with this angle bracket is telling the system to output the results into whatever we specify after it, which in this case is going to be the info.txt file. Now if I hit enter, it's going to go on to the next line, and I can start to type. So I'll just say hello world, enter, and then I'm going to do a Control D to basically get out of that mode. Okay, now if I do cat info.txt, you'll see that hello world has actually been printed to that file. I can also open it up. So let's say open info. That would open it up on my file system here on my text editor, and you can see it says hello world. All right, now we could even use just the angle bracket. Like I could do right angle bracket and info.txt, and now I'll just do hello, and let's do Control D, and now we can say cat info.txt, and you can see that it basically just overwrote the hello world with hello. Now, if I want to append to that and add a new line or new lines, I can say cat and then the double angle brackets and then info.txt, and then I'll put in world and Control D. Now let's look at info, and now we have hello on the first line, and then we appended world on the next line. We can also use the N option if we want to show line numbers. So there you go, it shows the line numbers. Now what I'm going to do, because I want to add a bunch of lines to this file, I'm going to open it. So let's say open info.txt, open it with my text editor, and then I'm just going to paste in line 1 through line 21, and I'm going to save that. Now, in addition to cat, if we want to read the file, we can also use the less command. And what less will do is it'll show us the content, but it'll also allow us to scroll. So we can basically use the arrows or page up and down to view the entire file. And then when we're done, we can just hit Q and it'll basically, bring us back. So that's less. Now, if you want to only see part of the file, so a certain amount of lines from either the top or bottom, we have the head and the tail commands. So for instance, if we say head info.txt, it shows us the first 10 lines by default. If you want to specify the line numbers, then we could do head -n and then whatever number of lines, let's say 5, and now you'll see it only shows me the first 5. And then you can basically do the same thing from the bottom with tail. So if I say tail and then the name of the file, it gives me the last 10 lines. And I can also specify, let's say n, and we'll say 5 from the bottom, info.txt, and then it shows us the last 5 lines. Okay, so that's head and tail. Now, I've been using the GUI text editor, but there's also terminal-based text editors. There's Vim, there's Nano, which is really simple. That's what I would definitely suggest that you start with. And Nano is installed, it's pre-installed on most Linux distributions, on Mac. It's even available with Git Bash. So I could just say Nano and then the name of the file, open it up, and now I basically have a text editor here. So if I want to come down here and just add to this, I could say line 22, line 23. Now, if I want to escape out of this terminal, I can go ahead and do Control X, and it's going to ask me if I want to save. I'll hit Y for yes, and then hit Enter, and now that should be saved. So now if I do less info.txt and scroll down, I should see my new line 22 and line 23. And we'll hit Q to exit. So it's good to at least know Nano, because when you're dealing with servers or headless operating systems, you can't just open up Notepad or whatever it might be on your GUI. So you have to use some kind of terminal-based editor. Now the next command I want to show you is echo. So if we want to just display some text, we can just say echo. We'll say echo hello world, and it will just print out hello world. But we can also echo to a file. So we can say echo hello world, and then we can use our right angle bracket and then specify a file. Let's say info2.txt. Okay, so now if I do less info2.txt, you can see that I have hello world in there. All right, so that's all I want to go over as far as reading and writing to files. Now, if you want to search for specific lines or patterns inside of a file, you can use the grep command for that. All right, so let's go ahead and say grep, and then we want to pass in the search term here. So let's just say, let's use quotes here because I'm going to use a space. So we'll say line 22. So that's what we want to search for. And then the file name, let's say info.txt, and it shows us line 22. Okay, so it just finds the text. If we want to find anything that has just the word line in it, we could do that. You can also use regular expressions and patterns. So I could do like an asterisk here. That'll also give me all the line numbers. It's actually really powerful. You can use all kinds of regular expressions. I mean, we don't have a lot to work with right here, but I just want you to know what that is commonly used for. All right, now we're going to look at the find command. So find is another very powerful command that we're not going to, look at in and out, but basically it finds the locations of files and directories based on conditions that we specify. So we're going to do something here. Let's create another directory, and let's call this files. And then we want to cd into files. And I'm going to show you how we can create 100 files with one command, and we can do that with touch. So let's say touch, and the reason I'm doing this is so that we have something to work with. So let's say touch file, and then we'll say dash, and then inside of curly braces, we'll do 001, and then we can do 2 dots, and then 100. And then after the curly braces, we'll do .txt. So what this is going to do is going to create 100 files, and they're going to be named file-001 and .txt, then file-002.txt, all the way up to 100. So let's go ahead and run that, and then let's do an ls, and there we go. We created 100 files in whatever, a couple milliseconds. So let's clear that up, and now if we wanted to find specific files, we could do find, let's say in the current directory by name, so dash name, and then if we want to explicitly put a file name like 002.txt, we could do that. If we wanted to do some kind of pattern like, let's say file 0 asterisk, or not 0, let's do 00, which should only give us 001 through 009. If I do file 1 asterisk, that will give us just the file 100.txt. Okay, if we wanted to find the empty files, we could do find, and instead of name, we're going to do dash empty, and that's going to give me all of them, obviously, because they're all empty. Let's see, what else can we do? Let's actually add something to one of these files. So I'll go ahead and just append, let's say, hello world. We'll use echo here. And then we'll append that to, let's say, file-033.txt. So now if I were to search for empty files, now 33 isn't going to show up. Now, one thing that makes this really powerful is you don't have to just use find to just find and print out files. You can find them and do whatever you want. So if we wanted to delete, let's say we wanted to delete all the files we just created, I could say find in the current directory, let's say name, and we'll say file dash asterisk, that should get all of them, and then we can add dash delete. And now if I do an ls, all those files are gone. Now another thing I wanted to show you is piping, which is basically a form of redirection. So we can transfer any standard output to some other destination, including a file. So let's actually we'll create 10 files. So let's say file dash, and we'll do 001.010 and make those txt files. Okay, so now we have these files. Now I'm going to run the find command again. So we want to find files by name, and we're going to get file dash asterisk. And what I want to do is then pipe the output of this into a new file. So I'm going to use the angle bracket here, and we'll call this, let's say, output.txt. So I'm going to run that. And now let's run cat on output.txt, and you'll see that basically the result of that find command has been put into this text file. So really powerful stuff, and it may not seem like it just because we don't have much to work with. We just have a bunch of empty files. But when you're doing real tasks, this stuff is really powerful, and it's just stuff you can't do from the graphical interface. All right, let's cd out of files, and then let's remove the files directory. And now that's gone. All right, so now I want to show you how to create a symlink. And a symlink is a special type of file that points to another file or another directory. It's basically a shortcut. So we use the ln command to do this. We're going to do ln-s, and then the file name or the directory that we want to create a symlink for, which in my case I'm going to do, let's do our home directory and then downloads. Okay, so I want the entire downloads folder to be a symlink, and the symlink I'll call it DLS or DLDS. All right, so I'll go ahead and run that, and then if I do an ls, you'll see that we have this DLDS. Now if I cd into that DLDS and then I do an ls, it's everything that's in my downloads folder. Now I didn't copy the entire thing over to this folder that I'm in, or this directory. I created a symlink. So this stuff is actually located in the downloads folder in my home directory. All right, now if you want to remove a symlink, let's just cd back out of this. So if I want to remove it, then I would just do rm, just like I would remove any file or folder, and dlds, and now that should be gone. Okay, so that's creating a symlink. Now, if you're on Windows and you're not using something like Git Bash, you can create symlinks with mklink. So make link, and then whatever the symlink name I believe is next. So we could do like DLDS, and then you would do, whatever you're making that for. So that's if you're on Windows and you're not using something like Git Bash. So next I want to look at file compression and creating what are called tarballs. So if you're a Linux user, you know what tarballs are. If you don't, they're basically like a compressed file format, kind of like a zip for Windows. So if we want to compress a folder, we can use the tar command, so tar, and then we're going to add onto this C. So this is because we want to create, and then we also want to add zvf. And I'll have in the gist what all these flags mean. But basically we want the compressed file name, so I'm going to call it source, and it's going to have a tar.gz extension. Okay, so that's going to be the name of the compressed file. And then the folder or the directory that I want to compress is going to be I think it's src. Yeah, so now if I do an ls, you can see now we have this source.tar.gz file, which is just this, whatever's in here. I think it's just the HTML file. All right, now if you want to see what's inside a tarball, we can do tar, and then we just want to do tzvf, and then the name of the file, which is source.tar.gz. And you can see it shows us what's in there, just the index.html. If I want to extract it, let's actually make a new directory called test, and we'll cd into test, and let's extract it here. So for that, we use the tar command, and we use xzvf and our dash. You actually don't need the hyphen, but we'll put it. And then the name of the file. Now remember, we're in the test directory, so we want to go up one level, and then we want the source.targz. All right, so if I go ahead and do an ls, now you'll see that we have our source folder in here because we extracted it, we unpacked it from this tarball. All right, so pretty simple. There's more to just about everything I'm showing you, but I'm just trying to show you the basics of this stuff. But let's go ahead and remove the test folder or test directory. All right, so the last command that I want to show you is history. I think that's a good last command because it shows us the last few commands that we've run. And if you want to run any of these again, like let's say we want to run this make directory test again, I can just do an exclamation and then the ID, so 1602, and it runs that command again. So if I do an ls, now we have our test directory back. All right, so that's going to be it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Obviously, there's a lot more to this, a lot more to the command line. This is for beginners. My hope is that people that barely knew anything about the command line now at least know how to navigate around and deal with files. And usually, I know, most of you are web developers, and you're mostly going to be working with command line tools, npm and Git and certain frameworks, CLIs and stuff like that. But you do need to know how to navigate. But hopefully this helped you out, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.